There is an animal drifting under every ocean whose name means vampire from hell. It wears a black cloak. It has eyes the size of a large dog's on a body the size of a football, and when threatened it turns that cloak inside out to show you rows of what look like spines and sprays glowing slime in your face. Every deep-sea monster video ranks it high, but the scientists who finally learned what it does down there found something stranger than a killer. Forget what it kills. What will bother you is what it eats. Let's start with the boat, because the boat explains the name. In 1898, a German steamship called the Valdivia, pronounced Valdivia, left Hamburg for a 9-month loop through the Atlantic, the Southern Ocean, and the Indian Ocean. The man in charge of the science was a zoologist named Carl Chun, pronounced Keown, and he had a grudge to settle. A few decades earlier, a respected British naturalist had argued that nothing could live below roughly 300 fathoms, call it 550 meters. Too cold, too dark, too much pressure. Chun thought that was nonsense, and the Valdivia was his argument. Picture the deck of a coal-fired steamer at the turn of the century. Steel cable running out over the side for an hour before the net even reaches the depth they want. Then hours more hauling it back through freezing spray while the crew waits to see what the ocean has coughed up. They dropped nets and trawls deeper than almost anyone had gone before, and among the sponges and the anglerfish and the pale shrimp, they hauled up a small, soft, dark animal that nobody could place. It came aboard dead or close to it. Its body collapsed by the change in pressure and temperature, and it went straight into a jar of preservative. That is worth remembering. For the first 100 years of its scientific life, every human being who ever studied this animal studied a corpse. Chun described it in 1903. He looked at the 8 arms, the webbing stretched between them like the skin of a bat's wing, and the deep red-black colour, and he called it an octopus. He named it Vampyroteuthis infernalis, pronounced Vampyro, too. This is infer, now, is. Vampire squid from hell. Understand what that name was and was not. It was a description of a wet specimen in a jar on a rocking ship, coloured like old blood and wrapped in a cape. It was never a description of behaviour, because Chun had no idea what the animal did. Nobody would know for more than a century. The name came first, and the reputation grew around the name like a shell. Over the next 100 years, the vampire squid was hauled up maybe a few hundred times, almost always dead, almost always damaged, and the handful of papers written about it were arguments about anatomy, about how to classify a thing nobody had ever watched breathe. So what did Chun have in that jar? Something that had never been seen before, and has never been matched since. Because the vampire squid is neither a squid nor an octopus. Count the arms and you get 8, which sounds like an octopus. But tucked between the first 2 pairs of arms are 2 more limbs, thin as thread, that the animal can retract into little pockets and pay out again. Squids have 2 feeding tentacles with clubs on the ends. Octopuses have none. The vampire has these 2 filaments that behave like neither. Zoologists eventually gave it its own order, Vampyromorphida, and today it is the only known surviving member of that order. Every relative it ever had is a fossil. The technical phrase is phylogenetic relic, and if you want a cousin, its nearest living family is the octopuses, not the squids the name insists on. Think of it as the last speaker of a language. Everyone else who spoke it died out ages ago, and this one animal is still down there speaking it, alone, to nobody, in a body that carries grammar the rest of the ocean forgot. That is part of why the phrase living fossil gets stuck to it so often, and we will come back to why that phrase is only half right. Keep that in mind, because the story of this animal is a story about names that lie. Now go down to where it lives, because that is where the monster story starts to leak. The vampire squid spends its life in a band of water that rarely gets a mention outside oceanography departments. It has been caught anywhere from about 500 meters down to around 1500 and deeper, but its home is roughly 600 to 900 meters below the surface, and that band has a name. Oceanographers call it the oxygen minimum zone. Sunlight is gone. The water is somewhere between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius, and the oxygen in that water can drop to about 3% of what the surface holds. 3%. For almost every fish, squid, and octopus in the ocean, that layer is a wall. They pass through it on the way down or up, but they do not stay. Practically no other cephalopod on Earth makes a home there. Why does that layer even exist? Because of what happens above it. Sunlit surface water grows plankton by the ton, and when the plankton die they sink, and bacteria eat them on the way down, and bacteria breathe. Somewhere below the reach of light and above the cold, slow water of the deep, the bacteria have burned through the oxygen faster than currents can replace it. The result is a permanent belt of half-suffocated water wrapped around the middle depths of the ocean, thickest off the west coasts of the Americas and Africa, and across the northern Indian Ocean. Fish that blunder into the core of it slow down, then leave, then die if they cannot leave. The vampire does not leave. It never left. The method. And the way it manages that tells you what kind of animal it really is. It has the lowest metabolic rate ever measured in a cephalopod. Its gills are unusually large for its size. Its blood is blue, carried on a copper-based molecule called hemocyanin, and the vampire's version of that molecule grabs oxygen with unusual efficiency at the starved levels down there. Its body is close to neutrally buoyant, gelatinous, water-heavy, more like a jellyfish in texture than like the muscular torpedo of a market squid, so it does not have to fight to hold depth. Squids that hunt in open water burn energy every second just to keep from sinking, because muscle is heavier than seawater. The vampire solved that by getting rid of most of the muscle. It hangs. It drifts. Watch the remotely operated vehicle footage from Monterey Bay, and the first thing you feel has nothing to do with fear. The animal looks like it is asleep, arms open, filaments trailing off into the dark like fishing line, turning slowly in the current the way a leaf turns in a still pond. All of that is machinery for spending as little energy as possible in a place with almost no oxygen to burn. Ask yourself what kind of predator builds a body around not moving. Hold that question, because the animal's face is going to argue with you. Picture the animal at scale. The body is about 15 centimeters long, roughly the size and shape and color of an American football. That same dark rust and black. Set into that football are two eyes about 2.5 centimeters across. Blue in some light, red in others, widely cited as among the largest eye-to-body proportions of any animal alive. If your eyes were built to that ratio, they would be the size of dinner plates. And an animal with eyes like that, at depths where the only light is made by other animals, is either hunting by that light or watching for whatever is hunting by that light. The eyes do not tell you which. Nothing about the appearance tells you which. That is the trap the monster videos fall into. They treat the size of the eye as appetite, when in the deep sea an oversized eye is just as often the mark of something that spends its whole life afraid. Owls have huge eyes. So do mice. Then there is the light the vampire makes itself. It has photophores, light organs, at the tips of its arms and scattered across the mantle. It has no ink sac. That detail alone should slow you down. Ink is a defensive smoke bomb for animals that live where there is light to block. 900 meters down, a cloud of black ink is invisible against black water. Useless. So the vampire evolved something else. When it is harassed, when a research vehicle's manipulator arm nudges it, or a predator makes a pass, it ejects a cloud of sticky mucus from those arm tips, and the mucus is packed with glowing particles. Bruce Robison and colleagues at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute described this in 2003. The glowing cloud can keep shining for as long as 10 minutes, long enough for the animal that made it to slip away into the dark while the attacker is still staring at a fading constellation of slime. It has another trick, and this one is the money shot in every deep-sea compilation. Threatened enough, the vampire pulls its webbed arms up and over its own body, inside out, like an umbrella blown backward in the wind. Biologists call it the pineapple posture. What you see from outside is a dark ball studded with rows of pale spines. Except they are not spines. They are cirri, soft, fleshy little fingers that line the inside of the arms, and they could not hurt you if you tried. The animal is hiding its head and eyes and putting the scariest-looking side of itself toward the threat. It is a bluff, the deep-sea equivalent of a cat arching its back and standing its fur on end. And like the cat, if the bluff fails, the next move is to run. And its top speed? about 2 body lengths per second, for a few seconds, using its fins and a jet. It cannot sustain that. It flees for a moment, and a moment later, it is a drifting football again, fins flicking, waiting to see if the threat followed. There is one more thing about the light that competitor videos never mention, because it does not fit the monster. In the lab, Robertson's team watched vampire squid pulse the photophores at their arm tips in patterns, brightening and dimming and swirling the arms so that the light seemed to move independently of the body. Nobody is certain what it means. The best guess is misdirection, a way of making a predator strike at a moving light instead of at the animal holding it. Everything about the vampire's light show reads as a way to be somewhere other than where the light is. Add up what you have so far. Enormous eyes, glowing slime, a body that turns into a spiked ball, a name that means vampire from hell. Every one of those features is either passive or defensive. Not one of them is a weapon. It has no ink to blind prey, no tentacle clubs to grab it, no speed to chase it. Its most dramatic move is a magic trick to help it get away. If it were the killer of the deep, it would be the worst equipped killer in the ocean. So the obvious question is the one that scientists could not answer for 100 years. If it is not hunting, what is it doing with those eyes and those filaments and all that time? The reveal lands in a paper with a giveaway title. In 2012, 2 scientists at that same Monterey Bay Institute, Henk Jan Hoving and Bruce Robison, published a paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B called Vampire Squid, Detritivores in the Oxygen Minimum Zone. They had done something nobody had managed before. Between 1992 and 2012, the Institute's remotely operated vehicles had logged 170 encounters with vampire squid in Monterey Bay, hours of high-definition video of the animal doing whatever it does when it thinks nobody is looking. Hoving and Robison went through all of it. Then they collected living animals, brought them up in cold, dark tanks, and kept them alive in the lab for months, offering them things to eat and filming what happened. Then they cut open the stomachs of museum specimens that had been sitting in jars for decades and looked at what was inside. Every line of evidence pointed the same way, and it was not toward blood. The vampire squid eats marine snow. If you have never heard that phrase, marine snow is the ocean's constant fall of the dead. Up near the surface, plankton bloom and die and their bodies sink. Tiny crustaceans called copepods and krill eat and excrete, and their fecal pellets sink. Gelatinous animals called lavaceans build filter houses out of mucus, discard them when they clog, and the abandoned snot houses sink too. All of it drifts down through the dark in a slow flurry of flakes, dead cells and poop and mucus, and every animal in the deep that does not hunt lives on it. Some of the flakes are so small you would need a microscope. Some are the size of a fingernail, clumped together with bacteria and sticky sugars into what oceanographers call aggregates, and those bigger flakes fall faster, a few tens of meters a day. So a piece of a diatom that died in sunlight on Monday can be passing a vampire squid's arm on Friday. The oxygen minimum zone is a busy place for snow, and there is a reason. The same rain of dead matter that feeds the bacteria who strip the oxygen out is passing right through the vampire's living room on its way to the bottom. The animal parked itself in the middle of the buffet line. Watch what the vampire does with it, because the mechanism is where the horror gets replaced by something weirder. Those 2 thread-thin filaments that puzzled zoologists for a century, they are fishing lines. The vampire pays them out, and they can stretch to something like 8 times the length of its own body, hanging in the water where the snow falls past. The filaments are sticky and studded with sensory hairs. When a flake of debris touches one, the animal knows, and it draws the filament back through its arms, wiping the particles off. The suckers on its arms, which have almost no grip and cannot hold anything, secrete mucus. The arms roll the debris around in that mucus until they have a little ball of dead stuff and slime, and the arms pass the ball to the beak, and the beak eats it. On the Institute's footage you can watch the entire sequence, and it is slow, almost ceremonial. A filament twitches. The animal draws it in hand over hand, the way you would haul in a kite string, wipes it through the crook of 2 arms and rolls what it collected between the arm tips for a while, before the ball disappears under the web. Then the filament goes back out and the waiting starts again. Nothing about it looks like an attack. It looks like an old man fishing off a pier. That is the vampire squid's dinner. A snowball of dead plankton and copepod excrement rolled in its own spit. The museum's stomachs backed the video up. Hoving and Robertson found copepod fragments, Larvacean house debris, radiolarian shells, diatoms, eggs and fecal pellets, the contents of marine snow, and almost nothing that looked like it had been alive and struggling when it went in. The lab animals did the same thing. Offer them the sinking debris and they fished for it. There was no ambush behavior anywhere in those encounters, no lunge, no capture, nothing that anyone watching the footage would call a hunt. The huge eyes, as far as anyone can tell, are for spotting the animals that would like to eat a slow, soft football, and for catching the faint glow of anything falling past that might be worth reaching for. The slime and the spines exist so that the eater of the dead does not itself become the dead. This animal never chases anything. It sits in water, so poor in oxygen that most predators will not follow it, and it waits for the ocean above to die and drift down into its arms. Which is why the name should have gone the other way. Less vampire, more gravedigger. If a story like this, one animal, no monster parade, just the real thing pulled apart, until it makes sense, is what you came for, subscribe. This channel does deep time and deep water every week, and the next one is already stranger than this one. Now let's go backward, because the title of this video makes a claim about 300 million years, and you deserve to know how much of it is true. Start in the Middle Jurassic, roughly 165 million years back, in what is now the south of France near a village called La Voulte-sur-Rhône, pronounced La Voulte-sur-Rhône. The site is famous among paleontologists because it preserves soft tissue, which almost never happens. Muscles, eyes, arms, the parts that rot away in a week almost everywhere else. And in that rock is a small cephalopod called Vampyromorphida rodanica, pronounced Vampyro, Nas A, Ro, Dan, Ike, that paleontologists have treated since its discovery as a close relative of the modern vampire squid. In the spring of 2022, Alison Rowe and colleagues published a study in Scientific Reports in which they put those fossils under a synchrotron, a particle accelerator that fires X-rays intense enough to image structures inside the stone without cracking it open. What they saw confirmed the relationship. Vampyromorphida already had the same peculiar way of attaching suckers to its arms that the living vampire has, a signature almost nobody else shares. But the suckers themselves were different, muscular and thick-walled, built to grip. Vampyromorphida's arms looked like they were made for grabbing hold of something that was trying to get away. So the vampire's Jurassic cousin was almost certainly a hunter, an active swimming predator in open water. The exact opposite lifestyle of the drifting scavenger we just described. Same body plan, same weird suckers, and a completely different job. Set that fossil next to the living animal and the story flips again. Nothing about the modern vampire squid's diet is ancient. It is a downgrade or an escape. Depending on your sympathies, something pushed this line out of the hunt and into the dark. We even have a hint of when. For a long time there was a hole in the record between the Jurassic and today, roughly 120 million years, with almost nothing from this lineage. Then in 2021, a team publishing in Communications Biology described a fossil from Hungary called Necroteuthis hungarica, pronounced Nek, Ro2, this is Hun, Ga, Iiku. About 30 million years old, Oligocene, and the rock it came from was laid down at the bottom of a sea called the Vampyroteuthis, pronounced Te, is, in water with almost no oxygen. Dead bottom water. That is why the animal fossilized at all, because nothing was down there to eat the carcass. And it means that 30 million years ago, a relative of the vampire squid was already living, or at least dying, in oxygen-starved water. The author's interpretation, and it is an interpretation, is that the lower oxygen specialization we see today was triggered as oxygen minimum zones spread through the oceans during the Cretaceous and the Cenozoic. The deep ocean got harder to breathe in over tens of millions of years, and one branch of the vampire family did what almost nothing else could. It moved in. Now push further back into contested ground and I'll tell you what is argued and who is arguing. The Bear Gulch limestone in central Montana is another one of those miracle sites where soft bodies turn to stone. It is about 328 million years old, Carboniferous, when Montana was a shallow tropical bay. That same year, 2022, Christopher Whalen and Neil Landman published a paper in Nature Communications describing a fossil from Bear Gulch as the oldest definitive Vampyropod, meaning the oldest known member of the entire octopus and vampire branch of the family. It had 10 arms with suckers, 2 of them possibly longer than the rest, and no chambered shell. They named it Calypsimopodi bideni, pronounced Calypsiomo, POHD, BY deni. And yes, the species name honors the American president in office when the paper was written, which the authors said openly. The next year, in 2023, a group led by Christian Klug, pronounced KOOG, published a rebuttal in the same journal. Their argument was that Calypsimopodi is the same animal as a fossil already known from the same rock, Gordoniconnus, and that some of what looked like arms were bulges of sediment. In their reading, there is no new species, and the octopus line does not stretch back quite that far. Whalen and Landman replied and rejected that, pointing to features they say Gordoniconnus has and Calypsimopodi lacks. As of this recording, it stands as an open dispute between 2 camps who have both handled the rocks, stepped back from the fight, and take in the shape of the evidence. Molecular clocks, which estimate branching dates from the genes of living animals, put the split between the octopus and vampire line and the squid line somewhere around 330 to 250 million years ago. The Bear Gulch fossil, if it holds, sits inside that window. The Jurassic hunter from Lavout sits inside it too. So the lineage that produced the vampire squid is somewhere in the range of 300 million years old, give or take a geological shrug. That part of the title is defensible. The rest of it is where I have to be straight with you. 300 million years is roughly the age of the line, not the species. Vampyroteuthis infernalis, as an animal you could catch in a net, is much younger, and nobody knows exactly how young. And the animal did not stop evolving, we just watched it not stop. Its Jurassic cousin had grabbing suckers and hunted in open water. Its Oligocene relative was already living in dead water. The living one has weak suckers, a mucus dinner, filaments turned into fishing lines, blood tuned for a place where almost nothing else can breathe, and a lifespan and reproductive strategy, which we will get to in a minute, unlike anything else in its class. Frozen in place is the wrong picture. That is an animal that walked away from the hunt and rebuilt itself around a corner of the ocean nobody else wanted. So when you see the phrase, living fossil, and it gets attached to this animal constantly, treat it the way you would treat the vampire name. It points at something real, an ancient body plan, a lineage that survived when its relatives did not. But it describes the skeleton, not the life. What is old about the vampire squid is the order and the outline. What is new is everything it does all day. And that is a better story. A survivor across 300 million years that got there by giving up on being a monster is more interesting than a monster that never changed, which raises the last real question. If it gave up hunting, and it drifts, and it eats snow, why has it survived at all? Why is it still here when the hunters it descended from are gone? 2 answers, and the second one is the one almost nobody has heard. The first is the neighborhood. Almost nothing that would eat a vampire squid can stand to be where the vampire squid is. Its oxygen layer is a moat. Sharks, big fish, big squid, most of them can only dip into that water for a while before they have to leave. Competitors for its food face the same wall, so the vampire lives with very few enemies and very few rivals, and its whole body is tuned to spend next to nothing on swimming, hunting, or fleeing. It has taken every expensive thing a cephalopod does, and either turned it off or turned it down. It is running its life on a fraction of the fuel its relatives burn. The second answer came out of a museum drawer. Around 2015, Henk Jan Hoving, by then working at an ocean research center in Kiel, Germany, and colleagues including Vladimir Laptikovsky and Bruce Robertson were going through vampire squid specimens collected in the 1960s and 70s and held at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. They were checking reproductive state, routine work, and they kept finding females that made no sense. You need to know one thing about cephalopods for this to land. every soft-bodied cephalopod alive, every octopus, every squid, every cuttlefish, breeds once and dies. Not most of them. All of them. A female octopus lays her eggs, guards them, stops eating, and dies as they hatch. Squid spawn in a frenzy and the spent bodies wash up on beaches. One reproductive cycle, then the end. It is one of the defining facts of the group. The museum vampire squids broke it. Hoving's team found females that had clearly already spawned, whose reproductive systems were resting with no ripe or developing eggs, and who nonetheless were carrying a full reserve of immature eggs waiting for the next round. They published in Current Biology in 2015. One female had released at least 3,800 eggs during her life so far, and still carried around 6,500 immature oocytes for the future. If she laid them in batches of about 100, that is roughly 38 spawnings behind her, and 65 more in front of her. Take that in slowly. 38 times she had bred and gone back to resting and built up energy, and bred again. And she was, by the count of what was left in her, well under halfway done. Do the arithmetic on lifespan and it gets absurd. Coastal squid live somewhere between 6 and 18 months. The team estimated the vampire's adult stage alone runs at least 3 to 8 years, and that is only the adult stage, so the full life is longer, and nobody knows how much longer. An animal that eats crumbs in water it can barely breathe cannot afford one enormous burst of reproduction, so it does the opposite. It spends its life in low gear, laying a little at a time, resting, laying again, for years. Slow food, slow breeding, long life. See how well those pieces fit. A one-shot breeder needs a burst of energy it can only get by eating hard and fast in rich water. The vampire has neither the food nor the oxygen for a burst, so it did the only thing that works on a starvation budget. It spread the cost of reproduction across a whole life instead of spending it in one season. It is the tortoise of the cephalopod world, and the hare, every other cephalopod, drops dead at the finish line every single generation. One last thing, because the reversal in this story goes past the animal and reaches you. The vampire squid is drifting as you watch this in temperate and tropical water in every major ocean basin on Earth. Atlantic, Pacific, Indian. Wherever there is an oxygen minimum zone in the right temperature range, there is probably a small dark football hanging in it with 2 threads trailing down, and that zone is growing. In 2018, Denise Breitberg, pronounced Breitberg, and a large team of ocean scientists published a review in the journal Science, pulling together decades of oxygen measurements. Since around the middle of the last century, the ocean as a whole has lost roughly 2% of its dissolved oxygen. That sounds small until you see where it went. In the open ocean, the area of water classed as low oxygen has expanded by around 4.5 million square kilometers, an area comparable to the European Union. The volume of water with no oxygen at all has roughly quadrupled. In some regions, the losses are 20 to 50%, and the upper edge of the low oxygen layer is rising toward the surface, in some places by as much as a meter a year, squeezing fish and everything that hunts them into a thinner and thinner band of breathable water above it. Warmer water holds less oxygen. Warmer surface water mixes less with the water below. Nutrients washing off the land feed blooms that die and rot and use up what oxygen there was. Each of those trends is a problem for tuna, for cod, for the fisheries that feed hundreds of millions of people, for the whales that dive through that layer to feed. And every one of them widens the moat around the vampire squid. Think about what that means. The line that spent 300 million years retreating from the hunt into water, nothing else could stand, is watching the ocean turn, slowly into more of that water, more dead water, more snow falling out of dying surface blooms, fewer predators able to reach the depth where it hangs. If you were designing a winner for the ocean we are building, you would design something very close to a football-sized animal, with big eyes and no appetite for the living. Almost every animal in this story is worse off in a warmer, thinner-breathing sea. This one is not. The name says vampire, from hell. The animal is a scavenger that eats what falls, and the layer of the ocean that goes by the same word, the dead zone, is not closing in on this creature. It is being handed to it,